Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our scoping series for CMMC Scoping. I'm Mark Hateman, president at Curie Solutions, and I've got Amira, our founder and main force, driving force behind our C3PAO status. Today, we're going to shoot video 6 in the series, and the topic for today is specialized assets. So with that, Amira.
Hurrah. Thank you, Mark. All right, I'm sharing my screen. And so first off, we've done this every video. The source of information about scoping for CMMC is provided by the Chief Information Officer, DoD. And when you go to this website, this CMMC Level 2 scoping guidance doc is what we're working off of. So we're talking about scoping for CUI, controlled and classified information for Level 2. And a lot of what we're talking about also applies to Level 3, but it's not a perfect match. Okay, so here's the scoping guide. And we've gone through each of these different categories of assets, and now we're down to specialized assets. So specialized assets are defined as assets that can process, store, transmit CUI, but are unable to be fully secured. And then it says, including the following categories, right? And I'm not a lawyer, but in general, when we see this including in a legal document, it means here's the things. Right. It doesn't mean what we mostly interpret it to mean, which is, oh, well, here's a ton of stuff and here's some examples. Generally, when we read official guidance, this including is actually saying, here's what we're talking about. That's what we're talking about. And it's not correct to say there's a whole bunch of stuff outside that category. Okay, so in this case, you could read this definition, right? Stuff that has CUI but cannot be fully secured. And you could go, oh, anything that I don't want to secure is a specialized asset, right? If you read it the traditional way. But the guidance version of reading it is, no. It needs to be one of these things that are listed off here. Okay. So let's talk about Internet of Things, industrial Internet of Things, operational technology, all that. So I'm actually going to go a little bit deeper in the document. We're going to find the area where it talks about specialized assets. And it gives us categories and definitions, okay? So again, note that it says, here's what's considered a specialized asset. It doesn't say everything that's hard to secure. It says, here's the list. All right, so first off, we have government furnished equipment, which is all equipment owned or leased by the government. And it includes equipment that the defense contractor acquires as basically that the government has told them to go acquire. Okay. Now, the way that I try to determine whether something is government furnished equipment is to ask the question at the end of your contract, if some other contractor wins the work, do you have to give that equipment back? Do you have to pass it along to the next contractor? Do you have to give it back to the government? If so, it is for sure this category. Okay, you don't technically own it. You're working with it as part of your contract, but it's not your contractor owned materials, right? That would be as opposed to something like a facility that you buy to do contracting work out of, but when the contract ends, you still own that facility, right? That's not government property. Now, we're going to get into the expectations for specialized assets, but the really rough summary is you don't need to fully secure them. Okay, all of these specialized asset categories. So an example.
What does fully secure? What does fully secure mean?
Okay, so let me bounce up to go through it. So this second category, or this second column, is the organization seeking assessment requirements. This is the instructions to the defense contractor. Here's what we expect you to do with this type of asset. And as we saw with the previous categories, it was basically make sure you know what you have, write about how you're doing each of the requirements in the SSP, and then prepare to be assessed against level 2 security requirements. Right. So it's saying for all these previous categories, they need to be fully secure. You have to be doing all the requirements for them, essentially. For specialized assets, that guidance changes. So yes, you still need to know what you have. You need to have an inventory of it. You should be writing down how you're applying the requirements to these asset types. So, how are you performing screen lock? How are you doing firewall? How are you doing patching? However, it does not say to prepare to be assessed. Right. So it says talk about how your assets are managed using your risk-based security policies, procedures, and practices. So, for example, if you can apply security to that specialized asset and it's not going to hurt anything, the DoD would like you to do it, right? If there is a significant risk to that specialized asset, the DoD would like you to address that risk.
If at all possible.
If possible, right. Yeah. If it's something that you can address while still achieving your function as a contractor. But they do not say prepare to be assessed down here. And that's a really big deal. So you get to decide what security you want to do for a specialized asset. And the DoD doesn't specifically require you to do any security. They just say, hey, be smart, right? Take common sense, risk-based approaches. But other than that, we're not going to require anything. So what that means to me is you can think of some pretty off-the-wall scenarios for how you could take a specialized asset and just be incredibly insecure with it, right? I'm going to take my government property or some other specialized asset that has CUI on it, and I'm going to put it in the middle of the street and just be like, good luck. Hope it doesn't walk away, right? And an assessor is not going to call you on that because we're not going to assess you against the security requirements. That's the wonderfulness of specialized assets. However, if you really did that, if you took CUI and you just threw it in the middle of the street because you knew that nobody's going to assess you about it, well, that's contradicting this instruction to show how you're managing it based on risk, right? The government could certainly say that was a really big risk. Anybody reasonable would have known better than to do what you just did, and they could hold you accountable, right?
So from a clarity perspective for an OSC, Curie as a C3 PAO will not be in their scope of assessment. However, if the DIBCAC would come or the DoD would come and find that asset sitting in the middle of the street, they're going to have a problem with it.
They would probably have a problem with it, but it's not going to be based on it's not going to be a problem based on their assessment if they're following these assessment instructions.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. But the government could say you're you're really messing up and try to get you in a different way. I don't know actually how they would do it, right? But it does leave that as an option here because they don't want people to just be terrible.
But
Right.
most importantly, for what we're talking about here, we would not assess that.
Right. Right. We're going to do the instructions in this last column, which are the assessor's instructions, which is we're going to read the system security plan to see what you're doing, right? And that system security plan might say patching. Yeah, we're not doing that, right? Complex passwords, not doing that either. And we're just going to read that. And that's it, right? That's our instructions. Now, for us to consider something to be a specialized asset, it does need to meet the definition in here, which is one of those specialized asset categories, such as government property, right? But yeah, that's we're not going to make you be secure. There's nobody forcing you to be secure about those assets. Okay, so let's come back down to the different types. Oh goodness. The different types of specialized assets. Very common government furnished equipment could be laptops issued to contractor staff. If you're doing like services on behalf of the government and you are sending people on site to a government facility, or they're using the .mil network, quite often they'll issue laptops. You do not need to do security for those laptops under CMMC, even if you plug them into your corporate network. Okay, that's the government's job to do the security on those things. You can also have facilities that are government furnished equipment. If the government says you need to do all your work out of this building on a military base, you do not need to do security for that building. We're not going to assess security. And then another example is if one of your contract deliverables is to create a government information system, for example. Like in the past, I used to work on military health systems, and one of the things that my contracts did was actually build up this database system, which consisted of a lot of servers and a lot of networking equipment in a data center for the military's electronic health record. And that health system, even though it was on a contractor's facility, like it was not on a military base, it was in a contractor's facility, it was equipment that was purchased by the contractor and managed and taken care of by the contractor. If we lost the contract during renewal, we would have had to handle that entire thing over to the next contractor, right? And that entire set of equipment and facility would have been considered government furnished equipment in that case, not subject to CMMC assessment. I will tell you though, in that situation, it was subject to very high cybersecurity standards, of course, right? We want to protect the health record of the military, but that was a government cybersecurity standard for government systems rather than contractor systems. All right, next, Internet of Things or Industrial Internet of Things. So IoT, most of us are familiar with that idea. Most common examples are cameras that you just plug into your network, and they can be managed through a website. The exact definition is interconnected devices having physical or virtual representation in the digital world, sensing or actuation capability, and programmability features. Okay, let's break this down. Interconnected, so they're networked in some way. They have a physical or virtual representation in the digital world. That's kind of a weird statement, right? But when we think about say, smart lights. There's that physical component of the smart light, but they're also they also have like an operating system and an IP address. Sensing or actuation capabilities. So sensing is learning about the environment. That could be some sort of a camera. It could be a sensor, like a temperature sensor, a smoke sensor, a power meter, right? And then actuation is changing something, making something happen. So this one's a little bit harder to get examples for, but say the smart lights, you could potentially turn the light on and off with the actuation capability. Or you could change, I don't know, the fridge, right? If you got a smart fridge or a smart television, you might be able to turn it on and off through this. All right, and then finally, programmability features. That's smartness, right? Now, one way that you can tell if you've got an IoT is if you go to a vendor website to manage it, it is quite commonly IoT. It could be also a highly sophisticated, computer network device, right? But if it's something that is small and simple, but you're managing it through, a Philips website, for example, that can certainly count as IoT.
And I'm assuming through the app, like a lot of Internet of Things use an app on your phone to manage, but you're still using their
it is still,
management.
yeah, going up to that vendor system.
Yeah.
The reason, so I personally, as a cybersecurity person, I am sketched out by Internet of Things. These things scare me.
Yep.
And the main reason why they disturb me, as opposed to other technology that we have, is because almost always by default, IoT, as soon as you plug it into your network, it calls home and says, "What would you like me to do, my vendor?" And it doesn't ask you for permission. You turn it on and it's like, "What would you like me to do to someone else?" And it will use open ports in your firewall to do that. Right? So you might have your firewall set up to block a lot of traffic, and this device inside your network opens a port through your firewall outgoing, assuming that you don't have it really, really locked down. And now it's under control by that vendor. They can potentially do something like send a software update to the device, which is malicious. There's a attack called DNS poisoning, where the vendor in this example, if say DNS poisoning occurred and all the smart cameras for some vendor got poisoned, okay, what that essentially does is some bad guy out there. So the domain name system is you resolve a simple name like, Philips.com into an IP address so that these devices can actually reach Philips.com across the internet, right? They need that translation. There's an attack where you can spam servers with the wrong IP address, or put up stuff which misdirects those IP addresses. That's DNS poisoning. And now instead of going to the IP address associated with Philips.com, you're going to a bad guy server, right? Well, these IoT devices might not know the difference. And they're saying, "Tell me what to do." And now a bad guy's got control of them. I am honestly surprised that we've had IoT for so long, smart televisions, for example, and there has not been a massive ransomware attack where all the televisions say, "Your device is encrypted, pay us $50 to get your TV back." There's also the potential where, again, it's on the inside your network, so it could attack laterally, right? So from a security standpoint, when I'm designing a network, I really want these things to be in a separate network by themselves, right? Maybe a guest Wi-Fi network. I don't want them being able to talk to the rest of my stuff. And typically you can't just lock them off of their vendor website. If you block their communication, they stop working, which is another problem, right? Now, of course, that is not to say that's how I'm going to assess them. If you can tell me that this thing is an IoT, I'm going to follow the instructions and scoping guide. I'm going to read the SSP, no further questions. But from a real risk perspective, these things sketch me out, and I recommend watching out for them.
Before we move past Internet of Things, I have a question that I'm sure we will hear quite a bit. Obviously, security cameras is one that you mentioned. But what about, let's use a brand name, Meraki, Cisco's Meraki. Is that a contractor managed asset, or that's a specialized asset because it connects, right? It's an Internet of Things technically.
So it actually, okay, so I know why you're bringing it up, because those, and I'm not sure if it's exactly the Meraki, but I know that, say, Fortinet firewalls are an example where there are certain types of network equipment like firewalls and switches and backup devices that are very much
wireless
controlled.
access.
Right, they're controlled by the vendor, right? So you go to the vendor's website, and then you can manage all of your firewalls from one place. Most assessors do not consider those to be IoT. They consider them to be a different class of devices, just a switch, a firewall, whatever.
Okay.
But they have the same extreme risks, in my opinion. That for devices like those vendor managed firewalls, that is a concern, because you're essentially giving this outside company access to your network, right? They can do the exact same thing where the device turns on, it reaches out, says, what would you like me to do? And they can come in from outside. So watch out for those. It is dangerous, and they might not be considered IoT, right? Especially if it's a more traditional network device. Most of us cybersecurity people, we only consider it IoT if it would have been something that was not on the network in the past. So if 20 years ago it didn't have an IP address and now it does, then we're going, okay, that's IoT.
Gotcha. Okay.
The last thing about this industrial Internet of Things is one of the names here, right? IoT. And it can be a little bit hard to think of what that is. So this is equipment that's basically IoT that's used during some sort of a manufacturing process. And an example I like to use is I once toured a potato chip factory. And yeah, I know, right? It's the best example I've got. I'm sure other people have got better ones, but at the beginning of the tour, you're following the line, right? And there's this big truck that pours the potatoes into a gigantic holding vat. And then the holding vat, the potatoes go down, and then they go through a slicing machine, which slices them like crazy. And each slice goes into this high-speed conveyor belt, and the conveyor belt's just going really fast, right? Above the conveyor belt is a camera. The camera is connected to some sort of programmability features that says, if I see a potato chip that looks green or black or brown, then that thing needs to go away. And it in this tour, they actually had a machine underneath the conveyor belt that would shoot compressed air, and all the weird raw potato chips that had, you know, rot or whatever, they just fly off the conveyor belt and they never make it to the oil, right?
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and it was going like 80 miles per hour. Like, it was pretty cool. That but that's what I think of with IoT, where it's performing, you know, it's kind of like operational technology, but it's got that sensing capability, right? Okay. Next up, operational technology. Operational technology are systems or devices that interact with the physical environment, or they manage devices that interact with the physical environment. So examples are building management systems. Have you ever seen those on, like, in the lobby of a big building, and like the firefighters can get in there and see where the smoke detectors are, and you know, maybe unlock all the elevators from there? Fire control systems, physical access control mechanisms. This one's actually a brand new thing in the final rule of CMMC. They added this. So what could that be? I've seen man traps, you know, where it's an electronically controlled gate that you have to go through, and once it verifies you're good, it opens up the other door. And potentially we've got a situation where those systems are considered operational technology, which is pretty cool. Much more common examples would be equipment used to cut parts or machine parts that does it based on jobs, you know, programmed in jobs. So if you are a high-tech machine shop, a lot of what you're doing is feeding CAD designs to a thing you have, and it just goes, right?
Yeah, I was thinking CNC machines that you'll see in a large manufacturing facility, that you actually write the code, the CAD is turned into the code that's needed to cut that piece of metal into whatever it's being cut into.
Absolutely. So when okay, so before I jump over to paint, operational technology, the way you can recognize it is so it's very commonly old. It's an old piece of equipment, which might be 30 years old, in the middle of the shop, and it's connected to the network. And you're like, what is going on, right? And it might even be running an operating system like Windows XP. And what is going on, right? As an assessor, why do you have this on your network? And when you talk to the owner of the company or the foreman, they will go, we need this to do the work. This is how we do the work. And you say, oh, well, why don't you just upgrade it? And they go, no, 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 no. If I touch that, if I patch it, it's going to break, and the vendor will not support it, and we're going to have to spend $200,000 to buy a new one. We do not patch this thing. And they look panicked. Right? And that's one of the ways you can tell if it actually is operational technology, is when you say, why don't you patch it? Why don't you upgrade it? You know, why don't you assign a firewall to it? And they go, no, 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 right? That's one of the first indicators that you're dealing with operational technology. Another thing that you'll see, and here's where I'm going to start drawing. You'll see this device that looks very obviously like a operational technology, right? They put the bar right here, and then sparks fly, and you're like, all right, that is definitely a cutter or something, right? But then next to it, attached with a cable, you see a computer. It looks like a computer, right? And that computer is attached to the main network. And quite often, this computer will be running Windows XP or something, Windows 95 or ME. And you go, hey, what's this thing? That looks like a computer. That should not be a specialized asset. That should be a CUI asset. And they go, no, we can't patch this computer. We can't do security, or this thing over here stops working, right? And I would encourage you to accept that. If they say that, then generally that's for real. It's extremely common to have operational technology, the stuff that actually cuts or makes or controls, be managed by something that looks like a computer, but they're one thing. They're one asset, right? Now,
It's been highly specialized for what they do. Oftentimes, too, you can't even touch it. Like, it's the vendor that does, and they won't patch it because they know it will break it.
right. One of the ways you can do a check of whether this Windows XP computer is part and parcel with the specialized equipment is to say, hey, if I swap in a Windows 11 computer over here, right, and you just take this cord from over here and you just plug it in, will this thing still work? Right, that's one of the questions you can ask. If I swap in any computer, plug in the cord, will it still work? And they say no, then you need to consider this thing to be part of that unit. Okay, but if they say, yeah, it's fine, right? I'm just managing this device using a website, or I'm just programming the device with a thumb drive, and I just move the thumb drive and plug it in over here and it works, right? Then at that point, you should consider this to be separate. So it's really about whether these need to be controlled at the same level or if they can be managed separately.
What would you do without paint?
I'd have to spend a lot more time preparing PowerPoint
You're
diagrams
highly
and
adept at
Visio.
you're highly adept at using it for diagrams, and I wonder if Microsoft takes that away at some point. You might just have to quit doing webinars, right?
I know. That'll be when I retire, right?
There you go.
All right. Last thing, industrial control systems, and SCADA, supervisory control and data acquisition systems. Let me pull up a funny. So Homer, power plant. All right, now. Okay. I was a little bit afraid of doing this live because sometimes when you look for images, you get stuff that you're not ready for. But this is the classic SCADA system. Okay, so those are also operational technology. All right, next we're 3/5 done with specialized assets. Next one is restricted information systems. This means systems and associated IT components comprising the system. They are configured based on government security requirements and are used to support a contract. Okay, now this is my favorite specialized asset type because this category, restricted information systems, in a lot of cases, I'll be talking to defense contractors who they've been struggling with CMMC, you know, they've been working on it for a year and they're like, I just don't know what to do about this one server I've got. I can't apply FIPS or whatever to it because it'll break. Like I tried, it broke. We were down for 2 days and I cannot do it, but I also need it for the contract. And they're like, I just can't get certified because of this thing. And I'm like, hey, there's actually a category for that called restricted information systems. So I have to be careful not to be too loosey-goosey on this. So, you know, as we're evaluating whether something can be a specialized asset, you as the contractor need to be able to justify that the thing you're saying is specialized meets the definition. Okay? So you do need to be able to convince me that your system is configured based on government security requirements and it's used to support contract. Okay. But there's a lot of things like that. If the government requires you to use a certain software program to communicate with them, and that software program doesn't support encryption, right? They told you you need to use this thing. You don't have a choice. It's required for your contract. Right? I'm going to be pretty favorable about whether I think that's a restricted information system. You know, if you've got a development area where you're prototyping or testing stuff, and it's again, you know, something for the contract, and the government says this is how you're going to configure it. Again, probably going to be looking at restricted information systems. What I would say is, if you have a system that for some reason you cannot apply all the security to that system, and it's not used to support a contract, right? Then I would ask, why do you have it in scope?
Mhm.
If you've got something that you can't secure and it's not necessary, we need to start thinking about how do we get it behind a different firewall somewhere else, right? And why is there CUI on it if it's not used to support the contract?
Yeah.
So keep that in mind. I will do that sanity check on you. All right. Last, we have test equipment. So this is hardware and associated IT components used in the testing of products, system components, and contract deliverables. Now, this has been somewhat updated in the final rule in a favorable way. So previously, this was read to be very, very specialized to like measuring and sampling stuff. But now it looks like the definition has expanded a little bit, where we could be talking about a dev lab, for example, right? Which is one of the hardest things for contractors to secure. They need to loosen up the security a bit so that their programmers can test stuff, can make changes quickly, right? We don't want to be going through a change management review every time your programmer has to update a piece of code. But that is what is expected if you've got this, you know, system as non-test equipment. So if you've got, you know, obvious test equipment like spectrum analyzers, super easy to say that's test equipment. And if you have a dev lab or systems used for development and the development itself is considered CUI, which is pretty common, right? So if the government has hired your company to create a program for them. That program code is often considered controlled technical information. Right. So you can't necessarily separate the CUI from the program because that's literally the CUI there. We'd be looking at test equipment for those systems pretty strongly. So anyways, an assessor will review the SSP to verify that they're managed using your risk-based information security policy, procedures, and practices and accounted for within your scope. And that's really it. We're not going to try to tell you whether or not they need to be patched or multi-factor authentication or whatever. But we are going to ask very nicely without actually enforcing it. Please be smart about this stuff. Right? Put it behind firewalls, put it on an isolated network, something, right? Don't have it sitting on the street where it's really easy to attack your network from it. So any last mark before we?
No, I think that this should be helpful for any OSCs that are trying to understand sort of the differences or what they should, how they should handle, particularly Internet of Things. I think is one that comes up a lot, and then the control systems is another area, and I think this will be really helpful. That leaves us one more, which is the out of scope items, which you alluded to a couple of minutes ago. So
Yeah.
we'll be back with another video in the series to cover the out of scope items.
Awesome. Okay.
Thank you.
Until then.